As far as services, whether we're talking about a virtualized environment or a cloud service provider or our own data centers, pretty much all the same things apply. We want to make sure we're doing hardening, that we're patching, that we're locking down systems. So for sure, a lot of those things really don't change very much just because we're in the cloud. So we want to take all those same things into consideration when we're building cloud infrastructure. And certainly other IT security courses have probably covered many of these topics. Um, but as far as virtualization and cloud computing goes, especially in the virtualization. So let's kind of switch gears here and talk about virtualization within our own data centers. One of the technologies that we're going to have to be familiar with is probably iSCSI. We use iSCSI a lot in virtualization because it's very easy to mount drives using iSCSI over the network. So some of the vernacular with iSCSI is initiators and targets, which basically you have an iSCSI driver in a server that connects to an iSCSI target to mount the LUN. So you're essentially mounting a hard drive over the local network. And one of the things that the book talks about is oversubscription. So if you're going to have if you're going to use these storage mechanisms like iSCSI, and there's other ones as well, like network file system and so forth, but iSCSI is, I think, by and large right now, probably one of the most common storage protocols for storage in the data center. You want to make sure you have an isolated network for handling that traffic. So that's one of the strategies that a lot of folks use now is having a completely isolated network. So your VM hosts might have multiple network interfaces, actually more than just a few network interfaces. And what you could do is you can have some of those interfaces on the storage network and other interfaces on the more general network side. That way you can keep them completely isolated and you don't have to worry so much um, about traffic from these two different networks traversing the same infrastructure, the same switches and so forth. And it makes troubleshooting easier. It makes security easier. We could be less concerned with access to that data. But that said, it's still a good idea to make sure that with something like iSCSI that we're using encryption and we're using authentication. Even though it's its own network and it's isolated, the thing about iSCSI is if you don't have authentication encryption, then someone could just connect to an iSCSI target and mount it if they knew, if they knew some information about that iSCSI target. So you want to make sure that's secure. So there are mechanisms in iSCSI that allow you to do that, to do the authentication that I've been talking about, as well as to do the encryption on that traffic with iSCSI. Of course, all this adds overhead, but these are certainly things that we want to keep in mind um, when we're implementing things like iSCSI. And as I said, iSCSI is probably one of the most common storage protocols right now in data centers that use virtualization because of the ease uh, with which we can mount storage to virtual machines without having to have local storage in our virtual machine hosts. So you can kind of separate that infrastructure. Um, Also, whether we're in the cloud or in our own virtual data centers, we're probably going to want to have virtualized switches or software-defined networks, which you talked about a number of times. Increases the available bandwidth between different devices, creates a logical path out of multiple physical paths. So lots of good reasons to use virtual switches. It can allow us to do network isolation. So some other best practices. One thing to bear in mind with virtualization is, I talked about if you recall back from the unit where we discussed virtualization, I think it was maybe unit 3, and I talked about some features with VMware with vmove and things like that, where you can migrate virtual machines seamlessly from one host to another, or from one storage platform to another, and all those mechanisms do so in plain text. So it's important that all of that infrastructure that's behind the virtualization be isolated from the actual virtual machine network traffic that the clients on those virtual machines might have access to. So you want to have, if you, so sort of one of the strategies that we do with virtualization and building virtualized data centers is making sure that we have, number one, an isolated network for for storage, which we talked about, but also making sure that all of the network infrastructure for the VMs themselves between the hosts is also an isolated network. And then we have that isolated network for the actual VM traffic. in the front end, which our customers would obviously have access to. And software-defined networking gives us tools to do that at these different layers. So that's sort of a best practice for controlling access to all these things in a data center where we're using virtualization.